In May 1894, a Wisconsin farmer's plow struck something that would ignite a controversy lasting over a century. Buried beneath an ancient burial mound were two skeletons, brothers who stood nearly 8 feet tall. Within weeks, the Smithsonian institution arrived, collected everything, and the evidence seemingly vanished. What the DNA would later reveal wasn't what anyone expected. The spring of 1894 arrived late in Fond du Lac County, Wisconsin. Farmers worked their fields with urgency, making up for lost time after a harsh winter. Joseph McLaughlin guided his plow through soil his family had worked for 3 generations, following the same furrows his father had cut decades earlier. The plow blade struck something solid. McLaughlin assumed it was a rock, common enough in Wisconsin soil deposited by glaciers thousands of years earlier. He adjusted his course and continued. The plow struck again, then again. Whatever lay beneath wasn't a single boulder, but a structure. McLaughlin stopped his horses and began digging by hand. What emerged wasn't random glacial debris, but deliberately placed stones. Large limestone blocks arranged in a circular pattern. This was a burial mound, one of thousands constructed across the American Midwest by ancient cultures. Most farmers simply plowed around them, considering them nuisances that wasted productive land. But McLaughlin's curiosity overcame his pragmatism. He continued excavating, removing stones and earth with increasing care. The mound descended deeper than expected, suggesting whoever built it had invested significant labor. Ancient peoples didn't create such elaborate structures for trivial purposes. 3 feet down, McLaughlin's shovel uncovered the first bone. It was enormous, far larger than any animal bone he recognized. He carefully cleared the surrounding soil, revealing more bones arranged in anatomical position. This was a deliberate burial, not a random animal carcass. As more of the skeleton emerged, McLaughlin realized he'd found something extraordinary. The bones were unmistakably human, a skull, ribs, limbs, but their size exceeded anything he'd seen. The femur alone measured over 2 feet long. If this individual had stood upright, they would have towered over any living person. McLaughlin continued digging and discovered a second skeleton positioned beside the first. The 2 bodies had been buried together, lying side by side in what appeared to be a shared grave. Both showed the same remarkable size. Whoever they were, they had been buried with ceremony and care. News of the discovery spread through the farming community with remarkable speed. By evening, neighbors arrived to examine the find. By the next day, townspeople from Fond du Lac made the journey to McLaughlin's farm. Within a week, the site had become a sensation, with visitors arriving from across Wisconsin and neighboring states. Local newspapers dispatched reporters who measured the bones and interviewed witnesses. The accounts varied. Some claimed the skeletons measured 7.5 feet, others insisted on 8 feet or more. The skulls appeared proportionally larger than normal human skulls, suggesting these weren't simply tall individuals, but people with fundamentally different proportions. The discovery occurred at a peculiar moment in American history. The frontier had officially closed just 4 years earlier. Ancient Native American sites were being excavated, and often looted, across the continent. Museums competed for spectacular finds that would attract visitors and donors. And popular imagination remained captivated by tales of vanished civilizations and mysterious ancient races. McLaughlin found himself overwhelmed by the attention. Treasure hunters arrived, offering to buy the bones. Showmen proposed exhibition tours. Scientists requested permission to study the remains. The farmer, who had simply wanted to plow his field, now guarded what newspapers were calling the Giant Brothers of Wisconsin. The local historical society attempted to intervene, arguing the bones belonged in a museum where they could be properly studied and preserved. But before any local arrangements could be finalized, a different authority asserted jurisdiction. The Smithsonian Institution in Washington, claiming federal interest in all significant archaeological discoveries on American soil. Representatives arrived from the Capitol with official documentation and transport crates. They promised McLaughlin that the skeletons would be carefully studied, catalogued, and preserved for posterity. The farmer, impressed by their credentials and reassured by their scientific authority, agreed to surrender the remains. The Smithsonian team worked methodically, photographing the burial site, mapping the mound's structure, and carefully excavating not just the skeletons, but also associated artifacts, pottery shards, stone tools, and copper ornaments that provided cultural context. They packed everything in custom-built crates and loaded them onto a railway car bound for Washington. As the train departed, McLaughlin and his neighbors assumed they would soon read detailed scientific reports about the Giant Brothers. They expected the Smithsonian would confirm the extraordinary nature of the find and explain how such individuals could have existed. They anticipated the discovery would reshape understanding of ancient American populations. Instead, silence followed. Weeks became months. Inquiries to the Smithsonian received vague responses about ongoing study and analysis. The promised reports never materialized, and gradually, the Giant Brothers of Wisconsin faded from public consciousness, remembered only in local folklore and yellowing newspaper archives. Before the Smithsonian's intervention, newspapers across America had seized upon the Wisconsin discovery with enthusiasm bordering on hysteria. The story appeared perfectly calibrated for the sensationalist journalism of the 1890s, mysterious, dramatic, and sufficiently ambiguous to allow imaginative embellishment. The New York Times ran multiple articles, each adding new details that may or may not have been verified. One report claimed the skulls showed peculiar formations, suggesting a race distinct from known native peoples. Another described the femurs as proportioned for individuals of heroic stature, perhaps 9 or even 10 feet in height. Regional newspapers competed with increasingly elaborate claims. A Chicago paper reported that the burial mound had contained not 2, but 4 giant skeletons. A Milwaukee journal insisted the bones showed evidence of advanced civilization, including possible knowledge of metallurgy beyond what primitive tribes possessed. These exaggerations followed a pattern common in 19th century archaeology. Real discoveries provided the foundation, but journalists, showmen, and even some scientists couldn't resist amplifying findings to increase public interest. The line between documentation and entertainment blurred easily in an era before professional archaeological standards. The Wisconsin discovery fit neatly into existing narratives about ancient America. For decades, Americans had debated the origins of the impressive earthwork mounds scattered across Ohio, Illinois, Wisconsin, and surrounding states. These structures, some simple burial chambers, others complex geometric arrangements spanning acres, clearly required organized labor and sophisticated planning. Many white Americans found it difficult to reconcile these architectural achievements with contemporary native peoples, who had been systematically dispossessed and marginalized. Rather than acknowledge that native cultures had built the mounds, alternative theories proliferated. Perhaps a lost race of advanced peoples had preceded Native Americans. Perhaps ancient Egyptians, Phoenicians, or even the lost tribes of Israel had reached America centuries before Columbus. The Giant Brothers seemed to support these theories. If the bones truly belonged to individuals of extraordinary size, perhaps they represented this mysterious, lost civilization. Popular imagination connected various pieces of evidence. The mounds, the giant skeletons, scattered reports of unusual artifacts, into a coherent narrative of vanished greatness. Scientific institutions faced a dilemma. On one hand, genuine, unusual skeletal remains did occasionally emerge from archaeological sites. Gigantism and acromegaly, medical conditions causing excessive growth, had existed throughout human history. On the other hand, most giant skeleton reports proved to be exaggerations, misidentifications of animal bones, or outright hoaxes. The Smithsonian Institution had particular reason for caution. Founded in 1846, it had spent decades building credibility as America's premier scientific establishment. Its reputation depended on rigorous methodology and careful verification. Endorsing spectacular claims without thorough investigation would undermine that reputation. Yet the institution also recognized public fascination with such discoveries. Museums needed visitors and donors. Spectacular exhibits attracted both. The challenge lay in separating genuine scientific interest from sensationalism, in distinguishing real anomalies from manufactured mysteries. When the Giant brothers arrived in Washington, Smithsonian anthropologists faced exactly this challenge. Initial examination confirmed the bones were human and unusually large. But were they truly as extraordinary as newspapers claimed? Had the measurements been accurate? And what did the associated artifacts reveal about the cultural context? The head of physical anthropology, Dr. Aleš Hrdlička, approached the specimens with methodical skepticism. Hrdlička, a Czech immigrant who had revolutionized American physical anthropology, insisted on rigorous measurement protocols and comparative analysis. He had exposed numerous fraudulent, ancient American specimens and had little patience for sensationalism. His preliminary examination revealed something newspapers hadn't reported. The skeletons showed clear pathological features. The bones weren't simply large, but exhibited abnormal growth patterns, particularly in the skull and long bones. This suggested medical conditions rather than membership in a giant race. Hrdlička's findings created an institutional dilemma. Publishing a report that explained the Giant brothers as pathological cases would disappoint a public expecting confirmation of ancient mysteries. It would also validate critics who accused the Smithsonian of suppressing evidence contradicting conventional theories about American prehistory. The institution chose a middle path that satisfied no one. It acknowledged receiving the Wisconsin specimens, but published no detailed analysis. The bones entered the collections, catalogued among thousands of other human remains from archaeological excavations. No exhibition featured them. No research paper analyzed them comprehensively. This administrative burial proved worse than outright rejection. It allowed conspiracy theories to flourish, fed by the institution's silence. If the bones were ordinary, why not publish findings? If they were extraordinary, why hide them? The absence of information created space for speculation to multiply. Decades passed. The Giant brothers remained in storage while the Smithsonian's collections grew exponentially. Periodic inquiries from journalists and amateur historians received standard responses. The specimens existed, they had been examined, nothing warranted special attention. These non-answers only deepened suspicion. By the mid-20th century, the Giant brothers had become legendary among alternative archaeology enthusiasts. Books and articles cited them as proof that mainstream science suppressed evidence contradicting Darwinian evolution or challenging conventional timelines of human history. The actual specimens, gathering dust in a museum basement, came less important than their symbolic significance. The silence surrounding the Giant brothers created fertile ground for conspiracy theories that would persist for over a century. In the absence of official explanations, alternative researchers constructed elaborate narratives about what the Smithsonian had supposedly discovered and why it chose concealment over disclosure. The conspiracy theory's basic framework went as follows. The Smithsonian had confirmed that the Wisconsin skeletons belonged to a race of giants who inhabited ancient America. This discovery contradicted Darwinian evolution and the accepted timeline of human migration to the Americas. Rather than revise scientific consensus, the institution chose to suppress evidence, destroying or hiding specimens that didn't fit established theories. Proponents pointed to accumulating evidence of institutional pattern. The Giant brothers weren't isolated. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, newspapers regularly reported discoveries of oversized skeletal remains from mounds and caves across America. Many of these reports mentioned Smithsonian involvement, representatives collecting specimens, promising analysis, then producing no published results. A comprehensive catalogue compiled by alternative researchers listed hundreds of such cases. An 8-foot skeleton from Ohio in 1897, 7-foot remains from Tennessee in 1903, multiple giant skeletons from a West Virginia mound in 1930. The list grew longer, and in nearly every case, the pattern repeated: local discovery, institutional collection, subsequent silence. Critics of mainstream archaeology developed several theories explaining this supposed suppression. The most common invoked protection of evolutionary orthodoxy. If giants had existed in ancient America, and if they predated or coexisted with normal-sized populations, this complicated the simple narrative of human evolution from smaller to larger forms. Another theory suggested the giants represented a pre-Native American civilization, possibly European or Middle Eastern in origin. Acknowledging this would undermine Native American land claims and cultural heritage. The Smithsonian, according to this theory, suppressed evidence to avoid political controversy and to maintain simplified narratives about American prehistory. More elaborate versions incorporated biblical narratives. The Book of Genesis mentions Nephilim, giants who walked the earth in antediluvian times. Some theorists argued the Wisconsin giants and similar finds represented Nephilim descendants who survived the biblical flood and migrated to America. Mainstream science couldn't acknowledge this without validating biblical literalism. These theories gained traction partly because they addressed real frustrations with academic archaeology. The discipline did sometimes dismiss or ignore evidence that didn't fit prevailing frameworks. Racial biases did influence interpretation of Native American achievements, and institutions did occasionally prioritize reputation management over transparent disclosure. But the conspiracy theories transformed these legitimate criticisms into a grand narrative of deliberate suppression. They assumed coordination across decades and institutions, requiring hundreds of scientists and administrators to maintain silence about world-altering discoveries. They attributed to incompetence or malice what often resulted from mundane causes: limited resources, publication backlogs, shifting research priorities. The actual fate of many giant skeleton reports was less dramatic than conspiracy. Most proved to be exaggerations: tall individuals described as giants, normal bones measured inaccurately, or animal bones misidentified as human. Others were outright hoaxes, created by showmen or pranksters who understood public appetite for the sensational. When professional archaeologists examined supposed giant remains, they typically found pathological cases: individuals with gigantism, acromegaly, or other growth disorders. Such conditions have occurred throughout human history, appearing in all populations. Ancient peoples with these conditions often received special treatment in death, hence the elaborate burials that made their remains more likely to survive and be discovered. The Smithsonian's actual policy toward unusual skeletal remains was bureaucratic rather than conspiratorial. The institution received thousands of specimens annually. Limited staff and resources meant many received minimal analysis beyond basic cataloging. Publication focused on specimens offering novel insights about population history, cultural practices, or evolutionary questions. Pathological cases, while interesting, rarely warranted extensive research or publication. This bureaucratic reality, prosaic, unglamorous, frustrating, couldn't compete narratively with tales of conspiracy and suppression. The truth that the Giant brothers sat in storage because overworked curators had more pressing priorities couldn't match the drama of claims they'd been deliberately hidden to suppress revolutionary discoveries. Into the late 20th century, the conspiracy theory evolved and elaborated. New adherents added layers, claims of underground storage vaults, assertions of destroyed evidence, allegations of intimidation against scientists who wanted to reveal the truth. The original Wisconsin discovery became one data point in a sprawling alternative history of suppressed archaeology. Some conspiracy theorists pursued legal action, filing Freedom of Information requests for Smithsonian records on giant skeletons. The responses, often incomplete due to poor record-keeping from the 1890s, fed suspicions rather than resolving them. Missing documentation became evidence of destruction rather than mere archival gaps. The Internet age amplified these theories exponentially.
Wilbur websites dedicated to giant skeletons shared the same newspaper articles repeatedly, each repetition treated as independent confirmation. Photoshopped images circulated, purporting to show excavations of enormous bones. YouTube videos strung together unverified claims into hour-long documentaries watched by millions. Yet, beneath the conspiracy theories lay genuine questions deserving serious investigation. Had the Smithsonian adequately analyzed the Wisconsin specimens? What were their actual measurements? What pathological conditions did they represent? And did the institution owe the public more transparency about its collections and research priorities? Modern investigation of the 1894 discovery required separating fact from embellishment, distinguishing what witnesses actually observed from what newspapers reported. This proved challenging because original documentation was sparse and often contradictory. Joseph McLaughlin, the farmer who made the discovery, gave several interviews to local newspapers. His descriptions remained relatively consistent. He had found 2 unusually large skeletons buried in a mound on his property. But when asked for specific measurements, his accounts varied. In one interview, he estimated the taller skeleton at near 8 feet. In another, he said 7.5 feet, perhaps more. This variation wasn't necessarily deception. McLaughlin wasn't trained in osteology. He measured the skeletons as they lay in the ground, curved and partially articulated, making accurate assessment difficult. The difference between measuring a skeleton laid straight versus as buried could easily account for 6 inches or more in estimated height. Journalists who visited the site added their own measurements, typically without professional training or standardized methodology. One reporter used a measuring tape on the exposed femur and calculated total height based on standard proportions. Another estimated by comparing the skull to his own head. These improvised techniques produced varying results, all reported as fact. The most extreme height claims appeared in newspapers that never sent reporters to the site. These publications relied on telegraphed summaries or copied stories from other papers, often adding embellishments in the process. Through this journalistic telephone game, near 8 feet became 8 to 9 feet, which eventually transformed into possibly 10 feet or more. Physical impossibility didn't restrain speculation. Some articles described skulls twice the size of normal human skulls.
a measurement that would require brain volume far beyond what human physiology could support. Others claimed femurs thick as a man's thigh, dimensions incompatible with bipedal locomotion. These exaggerations reflected journalistic incentives of the era. Newspapers competed intensely for readership. Sensational stories sold papers. Editors rewarded reporters who produced dramatic copy, not those who carefully qualified claims with uncertainty. The result was an escalating embellishment, with each paper trying to present the most spectacular version. The scientific illustrations published alongside some articles added another layer of distortion. Artists who never examined the actual bones created dramatic reconstructions showing massive humanoid figures, often with proportions more mythological than anatomical. These images, reproduced widely, shaped public perception more powerfully than written descriptions. When Smithsonian representatives arrived to collect the specimens, they brought standardized measuring equipment and documentation protocols. Their unpublished field notes, later discovered in institutional archives, told a different story than newspaper accounts. The taller skeleton measured approximately 86 inches as buried, just over 7 feet. But this included the spine's curvature and the positioning of the skull. When adjusted for articulation in life, estimated living height was approximately 82 to 84 inches, 6 feet 10 inches to 7 feet. Exceptionally tall, but not impossible. The second skeleton measured slightly shorter, approximately 79 to 81 inches in life. Both showed signs of pathological bone growth, particularly evident in the skull, jaw, and extremities. The Smithsonian team recognized these as characteristic features of medical conditions affecting growth regulation. Crucially, their measurements revealed the skeletons weren't proportionally scaled-up humans. The skulls were enlarged, but not doubled in size. The long bones showed abnormal thickness and continued growth at the epiphyseal plates, the growth zones at bone ends that normally fuse in early adulthood. This pattern matched known pathological gigantism, rather than membership in a giant race. The field team also documented the burial context, details largely ignored by newspaper coverage. The mound contained multiple burials at different levels, suggesting use over an extended period. Artifacts included typical woodland culture pottery and tools, dating the burials to approximately 500 to 1000 CE. Nothing about the cultural context suggested a distinct civilization. The giant individuals had been buried according to the same traditions as normal-sized community members. This context mattered enormously for interpretation. If the giants represented a separate race or species, one would expect distinct cultural materials, different burial practices, or evidence of isolation from other populations. Instead, the evidence suggested these were community members who happened to have pathological conditions, buried with honor by people who recognized them as kin, despite their unusual size. The Smithsonian's failure to publish these findings became the conspiracy's foundation. Had they released a detailed report in 1895 or 1896, explaining the measurements, the pathology, and the cultural context, the Giant brothers might have entered medical literature as interesting pathological cases. Instead, institutional silence allowed folklore to fill the void. Why didn't the Smithsonian publish? Multiple factors contributed. Dr. Hrdlicka, who would have overseen the analysis, was methodical to the point of slowness, often taking years to complete studies. The institution was simultaneously managing dozens of other excavations and acquisitions, each competing for research attention. And the political sensitivity around Native American remains made publication of any skeletal studies increasingly controversial. By the time these obstacles might have been overcome, public interest had moved on to new sensations. The Giant brothers became one of thousands of catalogued specimens awaiting detailed study that might never come.
The institutional assumption that unremarkable pathological cases didn't warrant publication priority proved catastrophically wrong in terms of public trust. For nearly a century, the giant brothers remained in storage, preserved but largely unstudied. The rise of molecular biology in the late 20th century created new possibilities for investigating ancient remains, but also new ethical complexities around studying human skeletal material, particularly Native American remains. The Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act of 1990 transformed how American museums handled indigenous skeletal remains. The law required institutions to inventory Native American remains, consult with affiliated tribes, and repatriate materials when cultural affiliation could be established. The Smithsonian, holding one of the world's largest collections of Native American remains, faced massive reorganization of its physical anthropology holdings. During this inventory process, researchers rediscovered the giant brothers. The specimens had been catalogued in 1894, but never systematically studied or published.
Their unusual size made them candidates for modern analysis, particularly now that ancient DNA techniques could potentially reveal information impossible to obtain through traditional osteological methods. However, conducting DNA analysis on Native American remains required careful ethical consideration and tribal consultation. The skeleton's probable woodland culture affiliation suggested connections to modern Midwestern tribes, particularly the Ho-Chunk Nation, whose traditional territories included the Fond du Lac area where the discovery occurred. Smithsonian researchers approached the Ho-Chunk Nation with a proposal: conduct limited DNA analysis to determine the skeleton's cultural affiliation and to understand the pathological conditions evident in the bones. The results would be shared with the tribe, and the remains would be repatriated once analysis was complete. After extended consultation, tribal leadership agreed to the study, seeing value in understanding their ancestors' experiences with medical conditions. The DNA extraction process began in 2003, utilizing techniques developed for ancient and degraded genetic material. Researchers selected the petrous portion of the temporal bone, the densest bone in the human body, most likely to preserve intact DNA molecules. They extracted tiny samples, processing them in sterile laboratory conditions to prevent modern contamination. Ancient DNA work resembles assembling a jigsaw puzzle with most pieces missing and many pieces damaged. DNA degrades over time, breaking into smaller fragments. Chemical changes accumulate, making sequences harder to read. Contamination from soil bacteria, fungi, and handling over the centuries adds noise to the genetic signal. Researchers must painstakingly separate authentic ancient DNA from modern contamination and environmental degradation. The initial sequencing results confirmed several important findings. First, the DNA was definitively human. Homo sapiens, not some archaic hominin or unknown species. This eliminated the most exotic theories about the skeletons representing non-human or hybrid beings. Second, the genetic markers clearly placed the individuals within Native American haplogroups, the broad genetic lineages that track human population history. Specifically, they carried markers common in Great Lakes region populations, consistent with woodland culture affiliation. This contradicted theories about European, Middle Eastern, or other exotic origins. Third, and most significantly, the DNA revealed specific genetic variants associated with growth regulation disorders. Modern understanding of gigantism and acromegaly has identified numerous genes involved in controlling growth hormone production and cellular response to growth signals. Mutations in these genes can cause excessive growth, leading to the extreme heights observed in pathological gigantism. The researchers focused on two gene systems particularly relevant to growth disorders: the AIP gene,
aryl hydrocarbon receptor interacting protein, and the growth hormone receptor pathway. Mutations in AIP are associated with familial pituitary adenomas, tumors in the pituitary gland that produce excess growth hormone. Mutations in growth hormone receptors can alter sensitivity to growth signals. Sequencing these specific genetic regions revealed that both skeletons carried a rare mutation in the AIP gene, a variant that would predispose them to pituitary tumors and excessive growth hormone production. The fact that both individuals carried the same rare mutation strongly suggested they were biological siblings, just as folklore had named them the Giant Brothers. This finding had profound implications. The condition wasn't random, but familial, inherited from one or both parents who were likely carriers of the mutation without expressing the condition themselves. In small, relatively isolated communities where cousin marriage was common, rare recessive mutations could appear with higher frequency than in large, genetically diverse populations. The genetic analysis also revealed the skeleton's biological sex. Both were male, consistent with traditional interpretation. Age estimation from DNA proved more challenging, but analysis of epigenetic markers, chemical modifications to DNA that accumulate with age, suggested both died in their late teens or early 20s, remarkably consistent with earlier osteological estimates. Understanding their genetics allowed researchers to reconstruct aspects of their lives with new precision. The AIP mutation they carried typically causes pituitary tumors that begin producing excess growth hormone during childhood or adolescence. The affected individuals would have experienced rapid, abnormal growth during their teenage years, continuing to grow beyond the normal age when growth plates fuse and height stabilizes. This excessive growth would have created numerous health complications. The cardiovascular system would struggle to supply adequate blood to an oversized body. Joint problems would develop as bones grew beyond what surrounding muscles and ligaments could properly support. Vision problems might occur if the pituitary tumor compressed the optic nerve. And social difficulties would arise from being dramatically different in appearance from community members. Yet, the burial evidence suggested these individuals weren't ostracized, but honored. The substantial mound constructed over their shared grave, the careful positioning of the bodies, and the inclusion of grave goods all indicated the community recognized them as important members, despite, or perhaps because of, their unusual condition. The genetic confirmation that the Giant Brothers suffered from pathological gigantism opened new questions about how such conditions manifested and were understood in ancient societies. Modern medicine provides treatments for pituitary disorders, but individuals in pre-industrial societies faced these conditions without medical intervention, their lives shaped entirely by the disorder's progression. Gigantism results from excessive growth hormone production, typically caused by a benign tumor in the pituitary gland, called a pituitary adenoma. The pituitary, a pea-sized gland at the brain's base, regulates numerous hormones controlling growth, metabolism, and reproduction. When an adenoma forms in growth hormone-producing cells, it creates a self-perpetuating feedback loop. The tumor keeps growing and producing hormones, driving continued abnormal body growth. The condition manifests differently depending on when it begins. If excessive growth hormone production starts before puberty, when growth plates in long bones remain open, affected individuals can grow extremely tall, the defining characteristic of gigantism. If it begins after growth plates fuse in adulthood, patients develop acromegaly, enlarged hands, feet, and facial features without increased height. The Giant Brothers' skeletal evidence indicated their condition began in early adolescence. Their long bones showed the characteristic patterns of extended growth, unusually thick shafts, delayed fusion of growth plates,
and continued bone formation well past the normal age of skeletal maturity. The taller brothers' estimated living height of 7 feet, and the shorter brothers' 6 feet 10 inches, both far exceeded the average height of Native Americans in that era, which was approximately 5 feet 6 inches for men. But height was only one manifestation. The condition affected every body system. Cardiovascular complications would have been inevitable. The heart, sized for a normal body, would struggle to pump adequate blood through vessels supplying an oversized frame. This typically causes hypertension, heart enlargement, and eventual cardiac failure. Most historical cases of gigantism resulted in death from cardiac complications by age 30. Joint problems would have developed as bones grew beyond what surrounding soft tissues could support. Knees, hips, and ankles would experience abnormal stress. Ligaments and tendons, unable to strengthen proportionally, would be prone to injury. Spinal problems would emerge from supporting unusual height and weight. Evidence of these complications appeared in both skeletons: arthritic changes in major joints, spine deformities, and bone spurs, indicating chronic mechanical stress. The pituitary tumor itself would have caused additional symptoms. As it grew, it could compress surrounding brain structures, causing headaches, vision problems, and potentially affecting other pituitary hormones. This might explain why both brothers died relatively young. The progressive effects of uncontrolled tumor growth eventually proved fatal. Understanding their physical suffering adds depth to interpreting their burial. The community that interred them with such care was honoring individuals who had lived with chronic pain and progressive disability. The giant brothers weren't the mighty warriors of mythology, but young men whose extraordinary height came with extraordinary suffering. How did their community understand their condition? Without modern medical knowledge, ancient peoples developed cultural explanations for unusual physical conditions. Some societies viewed exceptionally tall individuals as blessed by gods or spirits. Others saw them as cursed or marked by supernatural forces. Still others simply recognized them as community members who happened to be different. The burial evidence suggests the Fond du Lac community viewed the brothers with respect rather than fear or revulsion. The substantial effort invested in mound construction, the quality of grave goods, and the careful arrangement of bodies all indicate they were valued members of the society. Perhaps their unusual size was interpreted as a sign of spiritual significance. Perhaps they served special roles in ritual or leadership. Or perhaps they were simply loved family members who received appropriate burial honors. Comparative evidence from other ancient societies shows varied responses to individuals with growth disorders. Ancient Egypt apparently recognized and documented gigantism. Skeletal remains of individuals with the condition have been found in elite burials, suggesting high social status. Greek mythology included giants among gods and heroes, possibly inspired by real individuals with growth disorders. Medieval European records describe exceptionally tall individuals who served as royal guards or were exhibited as curiosities. The genetic finding that the brothers were biological siblings carrying the same rare mutation raised interesting questions about the population structure of their community. For both brothers to express a recessive condition, their parents likely were closely related, cousins or closer relatives, who both carried the mutation without manifesting the disorder. This wasn't uncommon in small, relatively isolated populations. Woodland culture communities numbered in the hundreds or low thousands, often maintaining kinship networks that encouraged marriage within the group. In such populations, rare genetic variants could reach higher frequencies than in large, genetically diverse populations. This could explain why both brothers developed the same rare condition. The DNA analysis also revealed additional health complications. Markers associated with immune function suggested both individuals had compromised immune systems, possibly secondary to their pituitary disorder, or possibly due to other genetic factors. This would have made them vulnerable to infections and might have contributed to their early deaths. Bone chemistry analysis, examining stable isotopes incorporated during life, provided information about their diet and health. The results indicated both brothers consumed diets typical of their culture, with no evidence they received special nutritional treatment despite their condition. They ate the same mix of corn, beans, squash, fish, and wild game as other community members. The mound that contained the giant brothers wasn't an isolated structure, but part of a broader mortuary landscape, reflecting complex woodland culture beliefs about death, ancestors, and the relationship between living and dead. Understanding this context illuminates how the community perceived and honored these unusual individuals. Mound building reached its peak in the American Midwest between roughly 500 BCE and 1000 CE, during what archaeologists call the Woodland period. Communities across the region constructed thousands of earthen mounds, ranging from simple burial chambers to massive geometric complexes covering acres. These weren't random constructions, but carefully planned monuments requiring coordinated labor and sophisticated engineering. The Fond du Lac mound belonged to the later woodland tradition, probably constructed between 700 and 900 CE, based on associated artifacts and burial practices. Its design followed regional patterns: a circular base, approximately 30 feet in diameter, rising 12 to 15 feet at its center, before being partially flattened by centuries of agricultural activity. The structure required moving roughly 300 cubic yards of earth, representing weeks of communal labor. Archaeological evidence indicates mound construction involved ritual as well as physical labor. Communities approached mound building as sacred work, often accompanying construction with ceremonies, feasting, and religious observances. The earthen structures themselves were conceived as more than simple graves. They served as monuments marking sacred space, anchoring communities to their territories through visible connections to ancestral dead. The mound's internal structure revealed intentional architectural planning. The giant brothers were buried in a central chamber, excavated into the original ground surface, then covered with earth to create the mound. But they weren't the only interments. Subsequent excavation revealed at least 4 additional burials at higher levels, added over decades or centuries as the mound continued serving as a community burial site. This layered burial pattern was typical of woodland mound use. Initial construction often accompanied burial of particularly important individuals, leaders, shamans, or in this case, individuals whose unusual physical condition gave them special significance. Later burials added family members or other community members, gradually transforming the mound into a multi-generational ancestral monument. The artifacts buried with the giant brothers provided cultural context often ignored in sensationalist accounts. Pottery sherds found in their burial chamber matched types common across the Great Lakes region during the late woodland period. Globular jars with cord-marked surfaces, typical of domestic pottery used for cooking and storage. This suggests the burial included food offerings or vessels for the afterlife journey. Stone tools accompanied the burials: projectile points, scrapers, and a particularly fine ceremonial blade made from Ohio flint. The presence of exotic materials like Ohio flint, over 400 miles from the burial site, indicated participation in long-distance trade networks. These weren't isolated people, but members of a community connected to broader regional exchange systems. Copper ornaments, mentioned in contemporary newspaper accounts but poorly documented, represented particularly significant grave goods. Native copper from the Lake Superior region had been traded throughout the Midwest for thousands of years, valued for its malleability and distinctive color. Copper objects required skill to manufacture and carried prestige value. Their inclusion suggested the brothers or their family held respected social positions. The most significant aspect of the burial was the brothers' shared grave. Simultaneous burial of 2 individuals suggested they died close together in time, possibly from the same illness, possibly from related complications of their shared condition. The community chose to inter them together, recognizing their relationship in death as it had existed in life.
This decision reflected broader woodland beliefs about kinship and the afterlife. Many woodland groups believed in spiritual journeys after death, travels through supernatural landscapes to reach ancestral villages or other afterlife destinations. Burying relatives together allowed them to make this journey in company, maintaining social bonds beyond death. The mound's location wasn't random. It occupied elevated ground overlooking what was likely agricultural fields or gathering areas. This visibility mattered. Mounds served as persistent reminders of ancestral presence, monuments connecting living community members to their dead. Every time people worked nearby fields or traveled past the mound, they encountered physical evidence of their history and lineage. Comparative evidence from other woodland mounds shows that individuals with unusual physical characteristics sometimes received special burial treatment. Several sites have yielded skeletons of individuals with dwarfism, skeletal dysplasias, or other conditions, often buried in prominent positions or with elaborate grave goods. This pattern suggests woodland peoples recognized physical difference, but incorporated it within their social structure, rather than excluding affected individuals. The care evident in the giant brothers' burial challenges modern stereotypes about how ancient peoples treated individuals with disabilities or unusual conditions. Rather than abandonment or ostracism, the archaeological evidence points to inclusion, respect, and even honor. The substantial investment in their burial monument, requiring hundreds of person-hours of labor, demonstrated community commitment to preserving their memory. The institutional silence that fueled conspiracy theories resulted from complex factors: bureaucratic limitations, shifting priorities, ethical concerns, and the fundamental challenge of communicating nuanced scientific findings to a public primed for sensational narratives. When the Giant brothers arrived at the Smithsonian in 1894, the institution's Division of Physical Anthropology was managing an overwhelming workload. Archaeological excavations across America were producing thousands of skeletal specimens annually. The Bureau of American Ethnology, the Smithsonian's anthropological research arm, coordinated numerous expeditions, each generating materials requiring processing, cataloging, and analysis. Dr. Alesh Hrdlicka, who joined the Smithsonian in 1903 and eventually became the dominant figure in American physical anthropology, encountered a backlog of unstudied skeletal collections. His methodical approach prioritized systematic population studies over individual case analyses. He wanted to document variation across Native American populations, establish baseline measurements for different cultural groups, and test evolutionary hypotheses through comparative osteology. From this research perspective, the Giant brothers represented interesting pathological cases, but not priority subjects for publication. Gigantism was already known to medical science. The condition's genetic basis wouldn't be understood for another century, but physicians recognized it as a disorder of the pituitary gland. Adding 2 more documented cases to medical literature held limited value. What made the specimens potentially significant, their age and archaeological context, remained unclear without better dating methods. Radiocarbon dating wouldn't be invented until 1949. Vetting the mound's age relied on cultural artifacts and stratigraphic relationships, methods that provided rough estimates rather than precise dates. Without confident dating, the skeletons couldn't meaningfully contribute to debates about population history or temporal patterns in genetic disorders. The Smithsonian also faced a credibility problem regarding giant skeleton claims. By the 1890s, the institution had investigated dozens of reported giant discoveries, nearly all of which proved to be exaggerations, misidentifications, or hoaxes. Newspaper accounts routinely inflated heights, misrepresented normal variation as extraordinary, or fabricated details entirely. This history of fraudulent claims made the institution cautious about publicizing any giant skeleton find. Even legitimate cases of pathological gigantism risked being sensationalized by media desperate for spectacular stories. Publishing a careful scientific analysis explaining the giant brothers as medical cases might be ignored, while sensational interpretations circulated widely. There was also the problem of what publication would accomplish. In the pre-DNA era, analyzing the specimens would involve careful measurement, comparison to other skeletal collections, and documentation of pathological features. The resulting paper would interest physical anthropologists and medical historians, but wouldn't resolve the public questions driving interest. Were these giants from a lost race? Did they represent unknown human variants? Did they challenge evolutionary theory? The honest answer, no. They were individuals with a known medical condition, would disappoint everyone hoping for revolutionary discoveries. It would provide ammunition for critics claiming the Smithsonian suppressed exciting findings in favor of boring, orthodox interpretations. And it would require the institution to invest limited publication resources in documenting what amounted to a negative result. As decades passed, the specimens sank deeper into storage. The early 20th century saw dramatic shifts in American anthropology's research priorities. Franz Boas's cultural anthropology gained prominence, shifting focus from physical measurements to cultural practices. Ethical concerns about studying Native American remains emerged, particularly as Native activists began challenging institutional control over ancestral bodies. By mid-century, the Smithsonian faced growing pressure to repatriate Native American remains to affiliated tribes. The 1960s and 1970s brought increased Native American political activism, including demands that museums return skeletal collections for reburial, according to traditional practices. This created a paradox. Specimens like the giant brothers became potentially important research materials precisely as ethical frameworks made their study increasingly problematic. The passage of NAGPRA in 1990 formalized repatriation requirements and consultation protocols. Museums had to inventory their collections, identify culturally affiliated remains, and negotiate with tribes regarding disposition. For many institutions, this meant reviewing thousands of poorly documented specimens, trying to determine their origins, cultural affiliations, and legal status. The giant brothers, rediscovered during NAGPRA inventory, presented a dilemma. They clearly fell under the law's jurisdiction as Native American remains, but their unusual characteristics and the century of speculation surrounding them gave them potential scientific value. Should they be repatriated immediately, or should limited study be conducted first? The Smithsonian's decision to approach the Ho-Chunk Nation with a proposal for limited DNA analysis represented a compromise. The study would address lingering questions about the specimen's origins and pathology. The results would be shared with the tribe, and regardless of findings, the remains would be repatriated for traditional burial once analysis concluded. This approach reflected evolved ethical standards in biological anthropology. Modern practice emphasizes collaboration with descendant communities, transparent communication about research goals, and recognition that indigenous peoples have rights regarding ancestral remains. The paternalistic approach of earlier eras, institutions asserting sole authority over skeletal collections, had been rejected in favor of consultation and partnership. Yet even this ethical evolution couldn't undo the damage from a century of institutional silence. The conspiracy theories had taken root, circulating in books, magazines, and increasingly on the internet. The actual DNA findings, confirming pathological gigantism rather than a giant race, would be dismissed by true believers as the Smithsonian's latest cover story. By combining skeletal evidence, DNA analysis, pathological understanding, and archaeological context, researchers could reconstruct significant details about the giant brothers' lives. Not just their deaths and burials, but their actual lived experiences in a woodland culture community over 1,000 years ago. Both boys, they were probably in their late teens when they died, would have appeared normal in early childhood. Gigantism typically doesn't manifest until adolescence, when the pituitary tumor begins overproducing growth hormone. Their first years would have been unremarkable, growing at normal rates, participating in childhood activities without physical limitations. The condition likely manifested around age 11 or 12, coinciding with the growth spurt of puberty. But while their peers' growth gradually slowed and stopped, the brothers kept growing. By 13 or 14, they would have been noticeably taller than contemporaries. By 15, dramatically so. By their late teens, when they died, they towered over everyone in their community. This rapid growth would have been accompanied by progressive symptoms. Headaches from the expanding pituitary tumor pressing against surrounding tissues. Joint pain, as bones grew faster than supporting ligaments and tendons. Fatigue from cardiovascular strain. Vision problems if the tumor compressed the optic nerves. These weren't temporary discomforts, but chronic, worsening conditions that dominated daily life. The skeletal evidence revealed specific manifestations of their suffering. Both brothers showed significant arthritis in the knees and hips, unusual for teenagers, but predictable given the mechanical stress of supporting excessive height. Their spines showed abnormal curvature, developing as back muscles struggled to maintain posture for increasingly tall frames. The taller brother's skull exhibited signs of increased intracranial pressure, likely from tumor growth. Their cardiovascular systems would have been particularly stressed. Hearts develop in proportion to body size during fetal growth and early childhood. The brothers' hearts, sized for normal bodies, had to pump blood to frames 50% larger than normal. This forced the heart muscle to work continuously at near maximum capacity, leading to cardiac enlargement and eventually failure. Daily activities would have become progressively difficult. Simple tasks like walking required more energy. Bending, lifting, and other movements put unusual strain on joints and spine. They would have fatigued easily, unable to keep pace with peers during hunting expeditions, agricultural work, or other community activities. Yet, the burial evidence suggests they weren't marginalized or excluded. The quality of their grave goods and the effort invested in their burial monument indicated they held respected positions. Perhaps their unusual size conveyed spiritual significance. Many cultures have viewed physical anomalies as signs of supernatural favor or divine marking. Perhaps they served ritual roles, their appearance adding gravitas to ceremonies. Or perhaps they were simply loved family members whose community adapted to accommodate their limitations. Woodland culture societies operated through kinship networks, where mutual obligation and support were foundational values. Families cared for elderly relatives, children with disabilities, and anyone unable to fully participate in subsistence activities. The brothers likely received similar support, contributing what they could while being supported in their limitations. The DNA evidence that they were biological siblings adds another dimension. They experienced their unusual condition together, each having someone who truly understood the physical and social challenges they faced. When one died, perhaps from cardiac failure, perhaps from infection, perhaps from tumor complications, the other likely followed soon after, whether from grief, from the same condition reaching critical stage, or from shared exposure to fatal illness. Their deaths probably occurred in late winter or early spring. The burial mound's construction would have been easier in warmer months when ground wasn't frozen. But mound building required coordinated communal labor, suggesting their deaths were significant community events. Perhaps their size and perceived spiritual importance meant their passing was marked with extended mourning and elaborate funeral rites. The community's response to their deaths revealed cultural values. Rather than simple disposal of bodies,
The community invested substantial effort in creating a lasting monument. This required leadership to organize labor, workers to excavate and transport earth, and probably ritual specialists to oversee proper ceremonies. The completed mound became a permanent landscape feature, ensuring the brothers would be remembered. Reconstructing their lives also means acknowledging what we cannot know.
We don't know their names. Those were lost when the last speakers of their language passed away. We don't know their personalities, whether they were gregarious or withdrawn, whether they embraced their unusual status or resented it. We don't know their internal experiences of pain, fatigue, and the knowledge that their condition was progressive and incurable. We don't know how their community explained their gigantism, whether through religious narratives, origin stories, or simply acceptance of human variation. We don't know if they were born to the same mother or were half-brothers. We don't know if other family members carried the same genetic mutation without expressing it, possibly passing it to descendants. But what we do know paints a picture of two young men who lived with chronic illness in an era without medical intervention, supported by a community that valued them enough to honor their memory with substantial investment of labor and resources. They weren't the superhuman giants of mythology, but real people, whose lives were shaped by genetic chance and whose deaths were mourned by those who knew them. The Giant Brothers of Wisconsin returned to their homeland in 2009 when the Smithsonian formally repatriated their remains to the Ho-Chunk Nation. A small ceremony, attended by tribal leaders, Smithsonian representatives, and descendants of the original farming family that discovered them, marked the end of their 115-year journey through museums and laboratories. The reburial took place near the original discovery site, in a location chosen by Ho-Chunk spiritual leaders according to traditional practices. The brothers were interred together, just as they had been in their original burial, accompanied by new grave goods selected by tribal members. This time, no mound was constructed. Modern Ho-Chunk burial practices differ from those of their woodland ancestors. But the brothers were returned to the earth among their people. The DNA findings were shared with the tribe before repatriation. Tribal leaders expressed satisfaction that science had confirmed what oral tradition suggested. These were their ancestors, not mysterious foreigners or members of a vanished race. The genetic evidence of pathological gigantism aligned with Ho-Chunk stories about individuals born with special characteristics who held significant roles in communities. For the scientific community, the case represented both achievement and cautionary tale. The achievement was methodological, demonstrating how ancient DNA could resolve century-old questions, confirming hypotheses, and providing information impossible to obtain through traditional osteological analysis. The cautionary element concerned communication and transparency. Had the Smithsonian published findings in 1895 explaining the pathological basis of the giant's height, decades of conspiracy theories might have been avoided. But perhaps not. Human appetite for mystery and sensation often overwhelms careful explanation. The conspiracy theories about giant skeletons persist despite DNA evidence, despite published rebuttals, despite the basic biological implausibility of the claims. Believers dismiss scientific findings as institutional cover-ups, creating an unfalsifiable narrative that evidence cannot penetrate. The case also highlighted how 19th-century journalism created lasting distortions. Newspaper exaggerations from 1894, claiming 8 or 9-foot heights, describing skulls twice normal size, continued circulating on internet forums and conspiracy websites over a century later, presented as factual reports despite their demonstrable inaccuracy. Once spectacular claims enter public circulation, they prove remarkably resistant to correction. For medical historians, the Giant Brothers provided valuable data about gigantism in pre-modern populations. The condition has existed throughout human history,
But most historical cases lack genetic confirmation or detailed pathological documentation. The Wisconsin skeletons, with their DNA evidence and careful osteological analysis, became reference cases for understanding how pituitary disorders manifested and progressed before modern treatment. The research also contributed to understanding population genetics in small, relatively isolated communities. The fact that biological siblings both expressed a rare recessive condition confirmed mathematical models predicting higher frequencies of rare alleles in small populations with cousin marriage. This had implications beyond medical history, helping anthropologists understand how genetic diversity varies across different population structures. The case entered educational materials as an example of how science corrects itself over time. What began as sensational newspaper reports eventually yielded to careful analysis, demonstrating how evidence-based investigation can distinguish real phenomena from exaggeration and myth. It became a teaching tool for critical thinking, showing students how to evaluate extraordinary claims and recognize the difference between scientific and pseudoscientific reasoning. Yet the enduring power of the giant skeleton mythology revealed something important about human psychology. People want to believe in mysteries, in lost civilizations, in evidence that challenges orthodox narratives. This desire stems partly from healthy skepticism about institutional authority. Governments and institutions do sometimes conceal information or present misleading narratives. But it also reflects romanticization of the past and discomfort with mundane explanations. The truth about the giant brothers, that they were ordinary people with an extraordinary medical condition, valued members of their community who suffered chronic illness and died young, might seem less exciting than theories about ancient giant races. But their actual story carries profound meaning. It reveals the humanity of ancient peoples, their capacity for compassion toward those with disabilities, and their investment in honoring those they loved. It also demonstrates the power of modern science to reach across centuries and answer questions that seemed permanently lost to time. The genetic code preserved in ancient bones becomes a message from the past, allowing people who died over 1,000 years ago to speak to us, to tell us who they were, where they came from, and what conditions shaped their lives. The Ho-Chunk Nation's willingness to permit limited scientific analysis before repatriation reflected wisdom about balancing respect for ancestors with the value of understanding history. The tribe recognized that learning the truth about these individuals honored them more authentically than allowing myths and speculation to persist. By confirming their ancestors' humanity, the research strengthened rather than diminished their significance. The Giant Brothers' legacy extends beyond their individual story. They represent thousands of ancient people whose remains have been studied, cataloged, and stored in museums worldwide. The ethical frameworks developed partly through cases like theirs, emphasizing consultation, consent, and repatriation, now guide how institutions handle human remains, creating more respectful and collaborative relationships with descendant communities. Their century-long journey from farmer's field to museum storage to scientific analysis to reburial traced the evolution of American archaeology, from colonial exploitation to partnership with indigenous peoples. It reflected changing understandings of who owns the past, whose voices matter in interpreting history, and how scientific inquiry can proceed ethically when studying human remains. In the end, the mystery of the 1894 giant skeletons was solved not by confirming spectacular theories, but by applying careful science to answer basic questions. They weren't mythical beings, lost races, or evidence of suppressed history. They were brothers, Native Americans with a genetic condition, honored by their community in life and death. That truth, revealed by DNA extracted from centuries-old bone, proved more meaningful than any myth could be.